I never thought I'd be sitting here telling this story, because up until recently, I thought I had a good marriage. Not perfect, but solid. No signs of betrayal, no late-night whispers, no lipstick on the collar nonsense. Emily was the kind of wife people envied, smart, kind, funny, loyal, or so I believed. But if you had asked me back then if I ever suspected anything, I would have laughed. The thought of Emily being unfaithful had never even crossed my mind. Until the high school reunion. I wasn't supposed to go. I almost backed out at the last minute. I hated those things, the forced smiles, the fake nostalgia, the people pretending their lives turn out better than they really did. But Emily insisted. She wanted to go. "Come on, babe. It'll be fun," she had said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Everyone will be there." That should have been my first clue. Because if everyone was going to be there, then Susan should have been too. Susan had been Emily's best friend since childhood. Ride or die. The kind of friendship that spanned decades, not just years. And lately, Emily had been making trip after trip back to our hometown, always with the excuse that she was visiting Susan. It had started slowly, once every couple of months. Then it became once a month, then twice. Each time I asked, "Everything okay?" And each time, she brushed it off. "Susan needs me right now," she would say, packing her bags with the kind of efficiency that made it clear she'd done this before. I didn't push. Why would I? Susan had always been in her life. And if Emily needed to be there for her best friend, I wasn't going to be the possessive husband who questioned it. But at the reunion, I ran into a woman I barely recognized at first. Her name was Lila, Susan's older sister. She looked at me with something strange in her expression, like pity. "It's so sad about Susan," she said, shaking her head. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Lila blinked. "You didn't know? She passed away." The words hit me like a freight train. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? Yeah. Lila sighed, sipping her drink. "Cancer. It was awful. She fought hard, but it took her last year." Last year. I don't remember much of what I said after that. I think I nodded, maybe mumbled something about how sorry I was. But my mind? It was racing, because Susan was dead, and that meant Emily had been lying. All those trips, all those weekends, she claimed to be staying with Susan. They were all bullshit. I felt a weight in my chest, something dark and heavy pressing down on my ribs. But I didn't say anything to Emily. Not yet. Instead, I made a decision. The next time Emily went on one of her visits, I wasn't staying home. I was going to follow her. And when I did, I found out the truth. I didn't sleep that night. I laid in bed next to Emily, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Susan was dead. So where the hell had Emily been going all this time? I wanted to shake her awake, confront her, demand the truth. But something in my gut told me not to. Not yet. If she had spent over a year lying straight to my face, she'd have an explanation locked and loaded. Some half-truth, some carefully spun excuse. And I needed proof before I let her see me bleed. So I waited. 3 days later, she gave me my chance. Emily came into the kitchen that morning, already dressed, hair pinned up, her travel bag slung over one shoulder. She smelled like her favorite vanilla perfume, the one she only wore when she wanted to feel perfectly put together. "Heading out early?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She smiled, kissing my cheek. "Yeah, Susan's mom invited me over for dinner, and I thought I'd go a little early. Spend some time in town, maybe visit the old bookstore." I sipped my coffee to keep my hands from shaking. Susan's mom? Did she think I was an idiot? She was giving me a new lie, in real time, just handing it to me like it was nothing. I forced a smile. "Sounds nice. When are you coming back?" "Sunday morning," she said, adjusting the strap on her bag. "I'll call you before bed, okay?" I nodded. "Drive safe." Then I watched her walk out the door. And as soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept my distance on the highway, staying a few cars behind, heart pounding harder than it had any right to. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe she had another friend she didn't want to mention. Maybe Susan's mom really had invited her over. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't innocent. Emily reached our hometown in just under an hour. She passed the exit that led to Susan's childhood home without even slowing down. My grip tightened on the wheel. So much for having dinner with her mom. She kept driving. Past downtown. past the old coffee shop we used to go to in college. Then, without hesitation, she pulled into a driveway. I recognized it instantly, because I had been there a million times. My father's house. I felt my stomach drop. Emily threw the car into park and got out like she belonged there. She smoothed her sweater, adjusted her hair, then walked right up the steps and let herself inside. Like she had the key. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My ears were ringing. My vision tunneled. What the hell was she doing in my father's house? And why'd it look like she had done this before? I couldn't move. I sat in my car, parked down the street, staring at my father's house like it would start explaining itself. Like the windows would peel open and whisper the truth. Emily had let herself inside. No hesitation, no knocking, no waiting. Like she belonged there. And my father? He lived alone. A retired, widowed man who barely left the house anymore, who called me maybe once a month to ask how the grandkids were doing. He had never mentioned Emily visiting, never brought it up in passing. So why the hell was she here? I checked the time. 10:42 a.m. I waited. At first, I told myself she'd only be inside for a few minutes. That maybe this was nothing. Maybe she was just saying hello. Maybe she needed to drop something off. Maybe I was lying to myself. Because minutes stretched into half an hour, then two, and Emily was still inside. I gripped the steering wheel, fingers cold and stiff. My mind kept circling back, over and over, trying to come up with some kind of explanation that didn't make me sick. Had she told me before that she stopped by to see him? No, never. Had he ever told me? No. And my dad, he wasn't the type to keep things from me. Not unless he had a reason to. A bad reason. I checked my phone. No messages from Emily. No calls. I swallowed hard. Then, just as I was about to lose my mind, the front door opened. Emily stepped out. I sucked in a breath, watching, barely blinking. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't rushing like she had been caught. No, she was calm, smoothing her sweater, brushing her hair behind her ears. She pulled out her phone and typed something. Then my father appeared in the doorway behind her, and I felt my stomach drop, because he wasn't just seeing her out. He was smiling. A slow, easy smile, one I hadn't seen on his face in years. Like he was happy. Like she had just made his damn day. And then, I watched him reach out, take her hand, and squeeze it. Not a quick, casual goodbye. A lingering touch. A private, quiet moment. Emily smiled back at him, said something. As she walked to her car, got inside, and drove away. And I sat there, numb, watching my father stand in the doorway, watching her leave. My breath felt shallow. My fingers tingled. I needed to know what the hell was going on. And the only way to get the truth was to come back. At night. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Instead, I drove around town, circling familiar streets like I was trying to ground myself. Like I could rewrite what I had just seen if I stayed in motion. Emily, my father, the way she smiled at him, the way he touched her. I could still see it, clear as day, burn into my brain like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. This was wrong. All of it. And the worst part? I still didn't know how deep the wrongness went. Because maybe, just maybe, there was an explanation. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she was helping him with something. Maybe he had asked her to stop by. Maybe she had kept it from me because she thought I'd be weird about it. Because look at me now. I pulled into an empty lot and leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the steering wheel. No, I wasn't going to talk myself out of this. I had seen the way my father looked at her, the way she had lingered, and my gut was screaming at me to go back. So I did. I parked down the street. The neighborhood was quiet, street lights flickering dimly against the pavement. My father's house sat still, dark except for the living room window. I checked the time. 11:07 p.m. Emily had been gone for hours. So what was my father still doing awake? I gritted my teeth, stepped out of my car, and made my way toward the house. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to say if he saw me. But I needed answers. Now, I moved toward the side of the house, keeping low, my heart slamming against my ribs. I felt ridiculous, like some jealous psycho sneaking around where he didn't belong. But I needed to know. I peered through the window. My father was sitting on the couch, a glass in his hand. Whiskey, his favorite. And then, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, squinting at the screen, and smiled. A small, private, secret smile. Then he typed something back. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. Opened my text with Emily. Nothing. No messages. I swallowed hard, a sick feeling curling in my stomach. And then, my father set his phone down, sighed, and leaned back against the couch, and murmured something to himself. Soft, almost too quiet to hear. But I did. I heard every word. She always smells like vanilla. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Everything went silent. I backed away from the window, my breath coming too fast, my chest burning. No, no, no. But deep down, I already knew. I had my answer, and it was worse than I ever could have imagined. I drove home in a fog, headlights cutting through the darkness, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. She always smells like vanilla. The words looped in my head, over and over like a curse. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. Because if I wasn't, if what I was thinking was true, then my entire life had just turned into something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the car, and it just sat there. The house was dark, quiet. Emily was already asleep. Of course she was. She had spent the day lying to my face, driving to see my father, texting him in the middle of the night, and smelling like vanilla. I swallowed hard and forced myself inside. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I went to the guest room and lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind running through every interaction, every offhand comment, every moment in the past year that had felt even slightly off. Had I missed the signs? I thought back to the way Emily had always spoken about my father, how much she respected him, how he was such a strong man for raising me alone after my mother passed. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. She was just being polite, a good daughter-in-law. But now I wondered if I'd been blind. I thought about the past holidays, the way she always made a point to sit next to him at family dinners, how she laughed just a little too hard at his jokes, how she always volunteered to pour his drink, refill his plate. And I thought about him, my father, the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, how to shave, how to be a husband. Had he been sitting across from me, smiling in my face while I shot up for bed, my chest tight. I couldn't do this. I couldn't just wonder. I needed to know. I needed proof. And if Emily was hiding something, if she had spent the past year lying to me, then her phone would have the answers. I got up, moving as quietly as I could. The bedroom door was slightly open, just enough for me to see her sleeping form curled under the blankets. I took a breath and stepped inside. Her phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it, fingers shaking. Then Emily stirred. I froze. She mumbled something in her sleep, shifting under the covers, and then went still again. I exhaled, carefully picked up the phone, and stepped out of the room. Back in the guest room, I sat on the bed, screen glowing in the dark. Locked. Of course. I tried her usual passcode. Wrong. Tried another. Wrong again. My pulse pounded in my ears. She had changed it, and there was only one reason she would do that. Because she had something to hide. I clenched my jaw, placed her phone on the nightstand, and sat back. I had confirmation now. I didn't need to hear it from her mouth. Emily was lying. Emily was cheating. But I wasn't going to accuse her. Not yet. Not until I had everything I needed. Because if she had spent the past year lying to me, if she had been sneaking around with my own father, then I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to destroy them both. The next morning, Emily acted like nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek, smiled at me over coffee, chatted about her trip to Susan's, the way someone might recount a lazy Sunday afternoon. And I let her. I let her lie to my face, let her weave her little fantasy, let her think I was still the same idiot husband she had been playing for a fool. It took everything in me not to break, to not slam my fist against the table and demand to know how long she had been sneaking around with my father. But no, I wasn't going to ask her. I was going to prove it. So I sat there, nodding along, filing away every word. Oh, you know Susan, she was saying, stirring her coffee. She's still the same. Always talking about moving to Florida, but never actually doing it. I almost laughed. She didn't even hesitate. Susan had been dead for a year, and Emily was sitting across from me, fabricating entire conversations with her like it was second nature. Like lying was just who she was. My stomach twisted, because if she could lie about this, if she could sit here, sipping coffee, spinning a story without even blinking, Then what else had she lied about? Had anything in our marriage ever been real? I forced a smile. Yeah, that sounds like Susan. Emily grinned. She asked about you, by the way. Said we should all get together sometime. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I had to give her credit. Most people would have tripped over their own web of lies by now. But Emily? She didn't even flinch. And it made me hate her a little more. She stood up, stretching. Anyway, I've got a shower. Long drive yesterday. I nodded. Go ahead. I watched her leave, heard the water start running. Then I picked up her phone from the counter. Still locked. Still changed. I exhaled through my nose, placed it back exactly where it was, and made a decision. I needed real proof. And I was going to get it. Tonight. I spent the rest of the day playing the role of the clueless husband. I asked her questions about her trip, let her pile lie on top of lie, each one digging her grave a little deeper. She had no idea I had followed her. No idea I had seen her walk into my father's house. No idea I had watched her smile at him, touch his hand. No idea that I had heard my own father whisper her name in the dark like a lovesick fool. And that was good, because the more comfortable she was, the sloppier she'd get. By the time night fell, I was ready. Emily went to bed early, exhausted from her trip, or whatever the hell she had really been doing. I stayed up, waiting, listening, and when I was sure she was asleep, I got to work. I had bought a small audio recorder earlier that day. It was cheap, easy to hide, and had a long battery life. I carefully placed it inside her car, tucked between the seat and the console, somewhere she wouldn't notice. Then I walked back inside, sat in bed, and waited, because Emily might have locked her phone, but she didn't know I was about to hear everything. The next time she drove off, I'd finally have my proof. And when I did, I was going to make sure she regretted every single lie she ever told me. The next morning, Emily was all smiles again. She made breakfast like she always did, pancakes, eggs, fresh coffee. The smell of vanilla creamer filled the kitchen, but all I could think about was the way my father had murmured, "She always smells like vanilla," to himself. I swallowed down the bile in my throat. I forced myself to sit across from her, to act like I wasn't suffocating on every second of this farce. Emily chatted about work, about a funny thing Susan said. The dead Susan. I gripped my fork so tight it nearly bent. But I kept my face neutral, because today I had a mission. The recorder was hidden in her car, and if she was still talking to my father, if she was calling him, texting him, making plans, I was going to have all of it. So I played my part. I kissed her goodbye. I watched from the window as she pulled out of the driveway. And the second she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed. She didn't go straight to work. Instead, she pulled into a small park on the other side of town. I parked far enough away that she wouldn't notice me, watching as she sat in her car, pulled out her phone, and started talking. To him. I couldn't hear her, but I didn't need to, because when she was done, she leaned back in her seat and smiled. Like she was happy. Like she had just had the best conversation of her life. I felt something snap inside me. I waited until she finally drove off, until I was sure I had enough recorded. Then I walked straight up to her car, yanked the recorder from its hiding place, and drove home. I sat in my office, staring at the tiny device in my hands, my pulse thundering. Then I pressed play. At first, just the rustling of her settling into the car. Then, the dial tone. Then, "Hey, it's me." Emily's voice, light and soft. Silence. Then my father's voice, thick with something I didn't want to name. "You made it home safe?" Emily let out a soft laugh. "Yeah, you worry too much." "I can't help it." A pause. "I hated seeing you leave." My stomach dropped. Emily's voice went lower. "Me too." Another silence. Then my father spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "You know, I almost told him." I sat up, so fast my chair scraped against the floor. "Told me?" Emily made a sharp noise, something between a gasp and a laugh. "Don't you dare. I feel guilty." "Oh, come on," she teased. "You were asleep. I was the one who got up in the middle of the night, and—" She cut herself off, like she had said too much. I froze. What did she just say? I hit rewind, played it again, and there it was. Emily, my father, sleeping together. And she had been the one to get up in the middle of the night, and my hand shook so bad I almost dropped the recorder. I felt like I was going to throw up. But then Emily's voice came through again, casual, breezy, like she was discussing weekend plans. "You act like this is all your fault," she said, amused. My father exhaled. "Isn't it?" Emily hummed. "I mean, technically, if you didn't sleep with your tool out, none of this would have happened." And then she laughed, like it was a joke, like she hadn't just blamed him for whatever the hell happened between them. My father didn't answer, and I sat there, shaking, realizing something I hadn't before. This wasn't just cheating. This was manipulation, and she was the one pulling the strings. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the wall, listening to my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The rage inside me was cold, precise. It carved through me, deep and sharp, until I could think clearly again. I had been looking at this all wrong. I had assumed this was some disgusting affair, Emily seducing my father, or maybe the other way around. But now I saw the bigger picture. Emily had been playing him. I had heard it in his voice. The guilt, the hesitation, the way he almost told me. My father was a broken man, lonely, vulnerable. And Emily? Emily had seen that weakness, and she had used it. She had convinced him that it wasn't her fault, that he was the one to blame, that he had somehow been responsible for what had happened between them. And if she could do that to him, then what had she been doing to me all these years? Every argument she ever won. Every time she twisted my words until I was the one apologizing. Every moment I had ever doubted my own instincts. She had been doing this to me too, and I had never even realized. I gritted my teeth, my pulse slowing, steadying. Emily thought she was in control. She thought I was still in the dark, but she had no idea what was coming. Because now I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to make sure she never manipulated another man again. I spent the rest of the day in a strange kind of calm. Not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that settles in right before a storm. The moment when everything goes eerily still, like the world itself is holding its breath. Emily had no idea that I knew. She walked through the door that evening, dropping her bag on the counter, stretching her arms like it had been any other day. "Long day?" I asked, watching her closely. She smiled, that same easy smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. "Exhausting. You wouldn't believe the day I had." "I bet." I nodded toward the fridge. "I figured you'd be tired, so I planned something special." Her eyes lit up. "Oh, family dinner." I grinned. "At my dad's place." For just a second, just the briefest moment, her smile froze. It was so fast that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Then she recovered, laughing lightly. "Oh, that's sweet. He invited us." I shrugged. "I called him earlier. Thought we could all catch up." She hesitated. Not enough to refuse, because that would be suspicious, but enough for me to see the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating, trying to figure out if my father had slipped, if this was a trap. I let the silence stretch, let her squirm just enough before I reached for her hand and squeezed it. "Come on," I said warmly. "You love spending time with him." Another flicker of hesitation. Then finally she smiled. "You're right." She exhaled. "That sounds perfect." I bet it did. We arrived at my father's house just after 7. The table was already set. 3 plates, 3 glasses of wine, a roast sitting in the center like some sick joke. Emily walked in first, her posture perfect, not a single hair out of place. I followed, keeping my expression carefully neutral. My father was already seated. He looked up at Emily, and for a split second, something flickered across his face. Guilt, regret, fear. He knew this was wrong, and yet he said nothing. Emily took her seat across from him, giving him that same damn smile she always gave me. I sat down slowly, pouring wine for both of them, letting the silence stretch. "So," I said, raising my glass, "to family." Emily smiled. My father hesitated, and I took my first sip, knowing exactly how this night was going to end. Dinner was slow. Emily talked about Susan. I watched her, fascinated. I had spent years listening to her lies, but tonight, I listened differently. She wasn't just lying. She was performing. Every story about Susan, every little inside joke she pretended to share, every fake sigh about how much she missed her dead best friend. And my father? He was silent, barely eating, barely breathing. I let stretch. Let the weight of the evening settle into the cracks. Let them both squirm. Then, casually, I picked up my phone, set it on the table. Press play. Emily's voice filled the room. You act like this is all your fault. My father froze. Emily went pale. If you didn't sleep with your tool out, none of this would have happened. The words slammed into the silence, ringing through the dining room like a death sentence. Then, Emily laughed. Not a real laugh. A nervous, desperate little sound. Wow, she said, shaking her head. You actually recorded me? Babe, come on. This is taken out of context. I leaned back, calm, patient. I'd love some context then. My father looked sick. His hands trembled against the table, his breathing uneven. He wasn't meeting my eyes. Emily turned to him. Tell him. Her voice was sharp now. Panicked. Tell him nothing happened. My father opened his mouth. Closed it. Then, he broke. His voice cracked. I never meant for it to happen. My stomach turned. Emily sucked in a breath, shooting me a look, like I was supposed to pity him, like I was supposed to pity her. I reached for my wine, took a sip, then I smiled. Emily, I said, voice smooth, how do you think Susan would feel about this? And for the first time that night, she had nothing to say. The silence stretched so thick it felt suffocating. Emily sat stiff in her chair, wine glass untouched, her mind racing behind those wide, stunned eyes. My father, he just stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow. He looked defeated. Good, because I wasn't done yet. You never meant for it to happen. I repeated, my voice unervingly calm as I turned to my father. So tell me, Dad, how exactly does something like this happen? His mouth opened, then shut. He looked at Emily. Emily looked furious, like a woman backed into a corner. Mark, she said finally, in that soft, soothing voice she always used when she wanted to control me. You're being emotional. I almost laughed. Emotional? I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the table. I think I've been pretty damn rational, considering my wife has been sneaking around with my own father. She flinched. My father dropped his head into his hands. And then Emily did the one thing I'd been waiting for. She went on the attack. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Her voice sharpened, her lips curling. You're acting like I cheated on you or something. What happened was a mistake, a misunderstanding. I exhaled slowly, staring at her. A misunderstanding? I repeated. Yes. She sat up straighter, like she had suddenly found solid ground. You're blowing this way out of proportion. If you had just trusted me instead of spying like some paranoid psychopath, we wouldn't even be here right now. I smiled. So it's my fault? She lifted her chin. Yes, Mark, it is. Because normal husbands don't set traps for their wives. My father looked at her like she had grown another head. You don't get to blame him for this, he muttered, voice hoarse. Emily's eyes snapped to him, sharp and furious. Oh, so now you're turning against me, too? I let out a cold laugh, shaking my head. Unbelievable. Emily turned back to me, face twisting into mock pity. Mark, you've always been so insecure. You never could handle the idea that I might need something outside of you. And honestly, she leaned back in her chair, voice cool and cutting. I shouldn't have to explain myself. If you were man enough. That did it. I reached for my phone again, tapped a button, and slid it across the table toward her. She frowned, glancing at the screen, and then her face drained of color. Because there, playing in real time, was the call recording. Not just from my father, but from the other man. The other one. She wasn't just sleeping with my dad. She had done this before. And as she sat there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, I saw it. The exact moment she realized she had lost. Emily was already shaking her head. No, she whispered. That's not real. I said nothing. I just sat back and watched. Watched as her entire world crumbled. Because she knew what was on that recording. It was her. Another late-night whisper. Another man. A different one this time. Not my father. Not even someone I knew. Just another name in what I now realized was a long, long list. And Emily, perfect, untouchable, always in control Emily, had finally been caught. She lunged for the phone. I pulled it back before she could grab it, my voice deadly calm. I have copies. Her breathing hitched. I turned to my father, who was staring at her now. Not with guilt, not with pity, but with horror. because he had thought he was the only one. And now he realized he had been played. Jesus, he whispered, running a hand over his face. Emily turned to him, frantic. It's not, I didn't. He shook his head, and then he stood up, didn't say another word, just walked out of the room. And that was the moment she broke. She turned back to me, all pretense of confidence gone. Mark, please. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I didn't yell. I just looked at her, and I said, "You're done." Emily gasped like I had struck her. Mark, I sent everything. I cut her off, voice flat. She blinked. I smiled. To your friends. I took a step forward. Her breathing quickened. To your family. Another step. She shook her head, eyes going wide. To your job. She clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. And to the lawyer who will be handling our divorce. She collapsed back in her chair, hands shaking. Mark, she whispered, eyes glassy with real fear now. You don't understand. I do. I leaned down, inches from her face. I let her see it. Let her see how much I had changed. How much she had made me change. I understand everything now, Emily. My voice was like ice. And that's why I'm making sure you lose everything. And then I walked out, without another word. Emily showed up at my door 3 days later. She looked like hell. Messy hair, dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept since the dinner. Maybe she hadn't. I didn't invite her in. She stood on my porch, wringing her hands, voice small. Mark, I just need to talk. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, silent. She swallowed hard. You sent everything. My job fired me. My mom won't even pick up my calls. I said nothing. She took a shaky breath. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. Her voice cracked. But I love you. I do. I got caught up. I don't even know why I did it. I watched her. She was lying. Even now, even after everything, she was performing. Trying to find the right combination of words that would make me forgive her. And she still didn't get it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You don't love anyone, Emily. Her eyes widened. I smiled. You just love control. Then I shut the door at her face. A month later, I got a message from an unknown number. Just a link. No text. I clicked it. It was a forum thread. A post from years ago. A different man, telling a story just like mine. About his wife. A woman who had seduced his father. Manipulated him. Lied. Destroyed everything. And her name? Emily. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. She had done this before. She had done this to someone else. And I had never really known her at all.